Greetings, friends. I am going for a walk on this most beautiful morning, and very stiff and very sore from working out for the last couple days. Going for a walk, getting limbered up, but also just enjoying this beautiful sounds of the world coming alive here in the early morning. It's a really pretty walk, so I figured I would use this as a chance to share this beautiful walk and talk about something that's been on my mind. What I've been thinking about is, a lot of things, but stemming from a book titled The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War, an audio book that I listened to, one of several that I listened to on my cross-country journey, which I recently completed. And very interesting book. I'll quickly say, basically the book is an unabashed defense of the Vietnam War and a counter argument against the prevailing narrative, which is that it was a wholly evil and kind of pointless war that was only there to line the pockets of, people in the weapons industry. And crooked politicians, etc. I did not come with, I would have to study the Vietnam War a lot more before I would ever even begin to come up with any kind of verdict regarding this. I don't know nearly enough to come to a verdict, so I just wanted to hear both sides. And but regardless, that is not the gist of what I want to talk about. The gist of what I want to talk about is just actually other thoughts that stemmed from the reading or from the listening of this book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War. It was written by the guy had been, I believe, a Marine in the war. And so it's definitely a personal defense of the men who fought in that war. One of the most surprising statistics that he shared, but he went on to, I don't know if he has his PhD in history, but he lectured at some universities, including the University of Washington, which is considered a public Ivy, which means it's one of the more highly esteemed public schools in the country. So, I assume he had some kind of higher educational credentials that were impressive. But regardless, the book is well researched, and he brings up a lot of really fascinating things. But one of the one stat that really blew me away, and really kind of gets into what I want to talk about today, was that he was saying it was, the image, and I don't know if this is the image across all age groups, because I assume with younger people, the Vietnam War is probably almost irrelevant with people like under 30 at this point, but I don't know about that. Maybe that's not right. But even my generation, which is, far removed from the Vietnam War, from personally experiencing the Vietnam War, even my generation has very strong images Vietnam War vets being all messed up and addicted to drugs and homeless and just forever ruined by the horrors of the war. But according to the author, that's not true. He said in polls conducted, it turned out that the Vietnam War vets on average actually went on to do better in life than the average American, which is a pretty startling statistic if true. And I do take it as being, he was referring to a legitimate poll, because like I said, he's an academic, he's a scholar. I don't think he would throw that out there. That bird sounds beautiful, eh? But, I'm Canadian all of a sudden, apparently. But, so the Politically Incorrect Guide, and those statistics. I found that really, interesting. But I'm not, it's not that surprising to me in a way. Like, when I first heard it, I was blown away by it. But then as I thought about it, it actually kind of made sense, because to my personal experience, I served in the military. And it's always shocking to me how, when I was going, my family was not a military family, so I didn't have much reference for it at all. And so I went in for my own personal reasons. that I won't go into. But suffice it to say, I did kind of have like a negative view of the military embedded in my mind, in the sense that I always grew up believing that, you know, only the screw-ups go into the military, and it's just kind of like a last-ditch effort for people who don't have anything better going in life. And honestly, kind of thinking like, yeah, people going, especially the combat arms, you know, if you're going into infantry or something like that, then you got to be dummy. And you got to be kind of stupid. And that is so not true. Like, you know, while I was in... obviously the military is a huge place, so you have, you know, the whole wide spectrum of human beings. But I would say on average, now, I did serve in a special operations unit, so my experience was probably a little different, but still, my experience in the military was that the average person in the military was more intelligent, more competent, and more well-rounded than your average American. And this is especially true in the younger ages, and obviously this is at least partly because of the structure of the military and the disciplinary environment. But I would look at, you know, I'd be serving like, it'd be a 20-year-old kid, and then I'd, you know, go home to visit and see other 20-year-old kids, and like regular 20-year-old kids, and be like, holy cow, there's not even a comparison. You know, I mean, like these civilian kids, I wouldn't trust to carry my duffel bag to the next room. But these, you know, 20-year-olds that I serve with, I trust my life to, literally. And so, you know, once I really thought about it, those statistics weren't that shocking. Except, you know, the whole thing with the Vietnam War and the stereotype of the Lieutenant Dan, wrecked and ruined Vietnam vet, does seem to have some merit, just because the nature of the war itself was... The nature of war is always terrible, but the nature of the Vietnam War in particular was held to be very, very traumatizing, very terrible experience for people. But, yeah, so I don't know. That statistic was really shocking, but there were a lot of other things that were really surprising. And, you know, he discussed a lot of those images that came out of the war that just about everyone has seen, even if you can't identify them. I'm referring to that horrific image of that young Vietnamese girl who is running away from the napalmed village. That one will be seared into your subconscious forever. It's a horrible picture. Also, the one of the guy being executed in the street, and the one of the monk burning himself in protest. Well, he went on to say, like, the stories behind those pictures, and actually Malcolm Gladwell discussed this a little bit in one of his books. I forget which one it was, but he discussed a little bit how the photographer for the one image later, I think it was the guy being executed in the street, later regretted allowing his image to be used the way it was, because the story behind that execution is actually very, very complicated and not really, it doesn't actually really reflect poorly on the American forces at all. And so the photographer came to regret the way he allowed that image to be used. But anyway, there are much deeper and more complicated stories behind all of those iconic images. These are iconic images that are, you know, seared into American consciousness. I think maybe global consciousness, though I'm not sure. But, you know, they're ones that you see in all the history books, all your textbooks, and you know, they're frequently just used almost as like archetypal images for the horrors of war. But the actual stories behind the images are all very complex, including that Buddhist that burned himself in protest. That story is much more complicated than you're usually led to believe. My point is, like I said, I have no interest in declaring like this is what I think about the Vietnam War. That's not my point. My point is this. After reading that book, and the author presents very valid points, very logical and rational points, as well as evidence to counteract all of these ideas and images that I have always taken for truth, just as flat truth throughout my life. It just really got me thinking about how unreliable history actually is, and how much of our concepts of history, which largely inform the paradigm of reality of how we see reality, and not only on a political level, but on a much deeper level, like on a metaphysical level. How much of this is actually unreliable information, and how much of it is deliberately unreliable, people taking images and events and oversimplifying them in order to push an agenda. And this is, like I said, this is a nonpartisan thing. This is happening all the time. And this is what I've always said when it comes to this stuff. My only real problem with the political aspect of it is when I hear one side saying, the other side does this. Like, dude, everybody's doing this. That's the point. Like, you want to get to this deeper level of inquiry and trying to understand and make sense of things. Got to get to that point. You realize that is what the whole game is. The whole media cultural history game is laying narratives on top of events. And if you want to actually dig in and understand any given era or period or event, it's much harder than just reading a couple paragraphs in a book, because the underlying events don't really make sense outside of the context of the other surrounding events. And as you broaden your perspective and your inquiry, you end up finding out that it's very, very rare that things are black and white. And it's usually a very complicated situation. And that finding the foundational facts to rely upon, that itself is often like a big fight. Cutting through the surface events, the surface facts, and getting to the deeper foundational stuff takes a long time. And that's why our understandings of things are generally pretty shallow, and why it's generally, in my opinion, dangerous, untrue, and harmful to go spouting that you have the answer figured out, you got it, it's black and white, and anybody who disagrees is an idiot. It's rarely that simple. But the degree to which the facts of the Vietnam War have in many cases been distorted, and it's just like the way that many facts that happened then were distorted in order to get people to support the war. All of these things, it just has me thinking about just the unreliability of history, which is not, I'm not attacking the field of history itself. Like, I think true historians, they try to do what I just said, which is to really get at the core meat of things. What I'm talking about more is public presentation of history, public consumption of history, in the way that history is used to enforce narratives that shape our own perception of reality, which shapes the way that we act in reality, which then shapes reality itself. And to read this politically incorrect guide, and I did research some of his claims, and everything that I researched that he claimed was backed up. But again, that doesn't mean that I finished the book saying, this guy, this is the definitive story of Vietnam, and this is how it is. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that all of these things that I took to be assumed truths for so long in my life, particularly when I was younger, before I figured the game out, and before I realized that a book is just a book written by a man or written by a woman, and it's not canonical law. It's a person's attempt to make sense of something using the best evidence that they can. And in some cases, they don't even try to use evidence. In some cases, they're just trying to persuade you and deliberately manipulate and lie. But anyway, back when I used to think like, oh, this guy has a PhD and he wrote this history book, so this has to be completely 100% valid. I had very specific ideas about the Vietnam War, which I think are pretty standard, that it was, just a totally stupid and pointless war that existed for no reason but to line the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Things like that. And it's actually much more complicated, but getting into the specific situations that are discussed, it's just amazing. Like those pictures, you have those pictures seared in your mind, and you make specific associations with them, and then to find out that the story behind the pictures isn't even what I thought it was all of this time. These, archetypal images burned into my soul, and the story behind them was actually much more complicated than what I thought it was. And not even more complicated, in some places contradictory to the interpretation that I was led to believe. And so there's that. But the bigger question that I've been wondering is, so where does that leave us? Because this isn't just me. This is happening all over to everybody. This is a very interesting time that we are living in right now. We're living in a time when illusions are being shattered, when the veneer of reality is being pulled away. We're seeing the gears and the cogs and the mangled bodies that were behind the plaster all of this time. And it's happening everywhere. Some of us are more conscious of it than others. But it's happening to everybody. And that's, I hear all this talk about people talk about the awakening and all of this stuff. I don't actually believe that. I don't think there's ever going to be some period where everybody sees deeper levels of reality. But there are more people who are looking around and saying, wait a minute, all these things that I thought were true are not true. And this is not only happening politically, which is the least interesting aspect of this, I would like to say. It's happening spiritually, in the sense of how we view the literal girdings of reality. I mean, of religion, of just existentialism, metaphysics, all of these things. People are looking at the former foundations of their belief systems and are starting to see the holes in them, and are starting to be more open-minded to other possible interpretations of reality. It's a very, very interesting time that we're living in. And it feels like it could go in any direction, doesn't it? It feels like it could go in a really good direction, or it feels like it could go in a really bad direction. We're going to find out. I'm staying hopeful. I think it's going to head for a good direction. But, so I've just been thinking, okay, if all these foundations of history, philosophy, even science in some cases, if all of these things are being stripped away, then where does that leave us as a nation, as a species? What does that all really mean? And not only just, okay, are we just going to replace it with new oversimplified narratives? Or are we going to get to a place where we realize collectively that reality itself is kind of tenuous, and that a lot of the former certainty that we had, that certainty itself is a myth, and that we live in a kind of an uncertain world where we don't know nearly as much as we formerly liked to think we do. But where does that leave us? Because that has some serious implications for life. You really think people, the average person, is ready to just go through life with this idea that they have no idea what reality actually is, or what the true narrative is, right? So I think a natural human reaction will be a lot of people will return to more traditional ways of life. Maybe people will start going back to the church, back to the mosques. Although I think Islam has actually been growing, but Christianity has been waning in a lot of ways. I've seen conflicting numbers, but even when it comes to church attendance numbers and something, in my personal experience, and this is something that I spend a lot of time listening to people and reading and talking to people, I feel like even the people who have continued to call themselves Christians, the depth of truly believing the Christian story to me seems to have faded largely. Not with everyone, but largely. But perhaps that will be reversed, right? perhaps people are going to want that solid foundation of that tried and true belief system that is offered by, the larger organized religions, especially the Abrahamic religions. Although I think, Buddhism is kind of the same way over in the East. So, yeah, maybe that will be the reaction to it, though I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of like the hero's journey. Once you leave town and once you strike out on your adventure, yeah, you come home, but you're not the same. Can everybody really return to the way they had been? I don't know. So the question is, for me, if that is not the answer, because that would be the most obvious and simple answer, everybody's just going to return, people are going to go back to the more traditional ways of life. And this is not a prescription of me saying that is good or bad. I'm not placing a value judgment on it. I'm just saying, perhaps that is what will happen, and that would be the simplest and most obvious thing. But what if it doesn't? Like, what if there are still collectively large portions of the population where we are left thinking, I don't actually feel very certain in all of these narratives that have been given to me to help make sense of reality. Well, what then? How do we live in an uncertain reality without total chaos ensuing? I mean, it's kind of like, comes back to like moral relativism. I have listened to all the arguments from moral relativistic perspectives, and I just don't see how society can function with a morally relativistic philosophical foundation. I've heard people say it, and it sounds good coming out of your mouth, but there's a lot of things that sound good coming out of academics' mouths that don't line up at all in reality. So, yeah, I'm just left very much wondering. So what would that actually look like? What would that mean? Like, what if this continues in the next age of humanity? Is this age in which there are no solid foundations, right? A world in which people no longer look at reality as a girded and solid thing, which I think is kind of where a lot of us are right now, right? Like, people are stuck in this kind of no man's land. Like, all right, what I believed in no longer seems true, so what now? And we haven't even begun to really feel the reverberations of that. Like, that's going to increase in time. How is that going to shake out? What's that going to look like? But what would a society be like where people were not able to share common myths? And I don't mean myths in a, like, I'm not saying that in a bit, like, I'm not trying to say that it's ignorance or stupidity. Like, to discuss the Christian myth, for instance, is not to denigrate Christianity, nor is it to even say that the Christian myth is untrue. And that's, hell, maybe it is, who knows? That's not my point. When I call something a myth like that, I'm just talking about the impact on the human psyche, right? And so all of us, if the Christ story is true and he was literally resurrected, and all of that literally happened, well, still here, a couple thousand years later, for us, it is still a myth. It is still acting as a myth on our subconscious and our minds and our conscious. That's all I'm saying. But yeah. So if we strip, if that kind of faith and certainty in something, and this is also secular, right? Like, on the other side, you have those who believe in scientism, and obviously that's a super oversimplification of those terms, both of the term belief and scientism. But I think you know what I mean, which is the idea that science can kind of be looked at as this existential, metaphysical guidepost. That it's got everything figured out. That's the way to discern all aspects of reality, etc., etc. I know for a fact that has been shaken in the hearts and minds of many people that I know. So it's not, I'm not like trying to talk specifically about Christianity, nor even specifically about religion. I'm just talking about the foundations upon which any given person has built their concept of reality. I think all of those foundations have been shaken in the last couple of years, which is really fascinating, because to me, in my perception of reality, how I think things go, to me, that indicates that there's something in the underlying quote-unquote code that is being played out around us, right? Like somebody decided to introduce a new variable, and that variable is shifting the nature of everything, causing everyone to doubt, causing everyone to feel uncertain in the things that they used to hold to be rock steady truth. And so then I feel like that's what's happening now. I feel like that's what we're living through. And so then the question becomes, is this state sustainable? Like, there is this feeling in my heart, and I think in a lot of people's hearts, that this is going somewhere, right? Like, for good or bad, it's heading in some direction. But here's the crazy thing, though. What if it's not? What if this is the next epoch? What if this is the next human era? An era of perpetual ambiguity, uncertainty. I've even seen it suggested that we're going to enter into a period where the way that humanity's consciousness interacts with reality is going to accelerate to the point that will have individuated realities on a level that we previously had never had before. That sounds super cool, and I can see how some people would think that would be a great next step for humanity. But what will that actually look like if that is true? And would it actually be a good thing? I suspect, like all things, it would be a little bit good, a little bit bad. I think that's how all reality is. As far as I can tell, that's like a law of nature. You know, it's the whole yin-yang thing. I think that's very true. So I think ultimately it would not be neither wholly pro nor wholly con. But what would the pros and cons be? What is that going to look like? What would that look like if every individual human being knew for certain that, you know, there is this sea of probabilities around us. A lot of them are fixed, but we can have very individual impacts on certain of the realities, which means that our realities would diverge from each other's realities to a degree, right? I mean, there has to be limits on this. I don't think it's going to be a situation where I can say, I decided to be a panther this morning and I turn into a panther, and then tomorrow I say, I decided to be a salmon and I turn into a salmon. Like, that's excessive. But if people understood that exerting their consciousness on the fabric of reality can truly alter reality, and if that process was accelerated by whatever variable has been introduced into the reality around us, what will that look like? So, I don't know, friends. I'm going for a walk thinking about these things, and I don't know the answer to it. But I think it's a very, very interesting exploration. Very interesting thought candy. And I'd love to hear what you all think. What do you think the future is going to look like? What do you think it's going to look like? I don't know. But all right, peace out, friends. It's a beautiful morning on this beautiful earth, and I hope you are all having a good one. Peace out.